The satellite went blind at exactly 0147. For 6 minutes and 32 seconds, a corridor across the Sahel, 300 kilometers wide, stretching from Niger's eastern border to the outskirts of Ouagadougou, simply vanished from every Western surveillance grid. No malfunction, no storm, no technical failure, just silence where there should have been a signal. October 25, 2025. By the time the feed returned, something had already moved through that darkness, something the world was never supposed to see. Intelligence officers in Langley, Paris, and Brussels would spend the next 72 hours trying to reconstruct what crossed that blind spot. The answer, when it finally came, was not in their databases. It was already on the ground, rolling towards a future that no longer asked for permission. A convoy. 23 vehicles, no insignia, no transponders, no borrowed flags or foreign escorts. Carrying Chinese-made fire support systems with 70-kilometer range, advanced radar coordination equipment, and cargo far heavier than steel. The end of dependency itself. Stay with us. This is not merely a headline. It is a hinge in history. If this story resonates with something deep in your chest, if you recognize the weight of a moment that changes everything, then like this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe. Not because we ask for numbers, but because some stories demand witnesses, and this one has only just begun. The first engine started at precisely 0200 hours. No headlights piercing the absolute dark of the Sahel. No radio chatter breaking the silence. Only the faint red glow of instrument panels casting shadows across faces that had learned to carry the weight of too many broken promises. In the lead vehicle, Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat with his hands resting on the radio console, not gripping it, not commanding through it, simply resting there, steady as stone. At 36, he was a soldier who had become a statesman not by ambition, but by watching too many villages burn, while diplomats debated timelines in air-conditioned rooms a continent away. Behind him, the convoy stretched into the darkness like a steel spine finally growing straight. 6 VN-22B fire support vehicles, their barrels wrapped in canvas to shield them from dust and from satellites that might still be watching. 4 SR-5 multiple rocket launchers, each capable of precision strikes at 70 kilometers, technology that until recently had been deemed too advanced for African hands. 2 WZ-551 command carriers with integrated coordination systems that could speak to each other without asking permission from Paris or Washington. But the numbers mattered less than their meaning. For the first time in decades, these were not gifts wrapped in conditions. Not loans with strings attached like puppet wires. Not foreign aid that came with instruction manuals written in languages that spoke of dependency disguised as partnership. They had been purchased, financed through Burkina Faso's National Sovereignty Fund, a reserve built from the country's own gold exports, established in July 2024 after the final Western training mission withdrew, leaving behind nothing but empty barracks and the echo of promises that never kept their word. Traoré remembered those years when every call for help had to travel north, to Paris, to Brussels, to Washington, through channels that moved like rivers through drought, slowly and never when you needed them most. How answers always arrived too late or not at all. How mothers in villages across the Sahel would whisper to their children, "They told us peace was coming," their voices carrying more weight than any treaty ever signed. That night, there would be no waiting. The convoy rolled deeper into darkness, each kilometer forward a statement written in steel and resolve. Every turn of the wheels was a refusal to beg for protection, to accept second-hand security, to measure sovereignty by someone else's calendar. As they moved through the night, dust rose behind them, silent and heavy, as if the earth itself understood that something irreversible was underway. The same roads that had once carried colonial convoys, that had seen decades of foreign troops arriving with promises and departing with excuses, now carried something different. Not occupation, not intervention, ownership. Western analysts, those who even bothered to pay attention, would later describe it as concerning. Beijing said nothing, a silence that spoke volumes. But across the Sahel, people understood what that silence meant. Dependency had died in the desert, and no one had asked for permission to bury it. Ibrahim Traoré was not born to revolution. Revolution was born to him through the arithmetic of abandoned villages and the algebra of broken promises. In his early years as a soldier, he had walked through settlements where schools had been converted into barracks, not by choice, but by necessity. Where children no longer played games that made noise because laughter, they had learned, could draw the wrong kind of attention. Where mothers spoke only in whispers, as if volume itself had become dangerous. He had counted the promises, 15 years of international summits, 27 different peace initiatives, $43 billion in development aid that somehow never developed anything but dependency. And beneath it all, a question that grew heavier each year. How long can a people wait for protection that never comes? The answer arrived not in a speech or a document, but in the silence that followed another unanswered call for help. Another village, another promise that someone would come, another day when no one did. In October 2024, standing before the nation on Independence Day, Traoré spoke words that would later be carved into the foundation stones of the new Sahel. Nous ne mendierons plus la sécurité, nous l'achèterons ou nous la construirons. We will no longer beg for security. We will buy it or we will build it. The French press dismissed it as rhetoric. The American State Department filed it under regional developments, but gold miners in eastern Burkina Faso heard something different. They heard the sound of their work transforming from extraction to investment, from export to empowerment. The French press dismissed it as rhetoric. The American State Department filed it under regional developments. But gold miners in eastern Burkina Faso heard something different. They heard the sound of their work transforming from extraction to investment, from export to empowerment. By December, the first deposits flowed into what would become the National Sovereignty Fund, not borrowed money carrying the DNA of foreign policy, not aid that came with advisors who stayed longer than the help they provided. This was wealth pulled from the ground beneath their own feet, refined by their own hands, converted into something no outside power could recall or rescind. Let us take a moment here, not to rush forward, but to give thanks. Write a comment with a simple thank you to Traoré, to Burkina Faso, or to the spirit of sovereignty itself. Gratitude is not a formality, it is recognition, it is dignity expressed in words. When you add your voice of thanks, you are not just engaging with a video, you are standing in solidarity with a story of freedom and pride. So, before we continue, take this pause to comment your thank you. Together, those words become a beacon that shines far beyond the screen. Traoré learned about silence in a village called Convoy, population 307. Or it had been 307 before the morning when the world's attention was focused elsewhere and help was promised for next week, pending approval from the Security Council. By the time approval came, Convoy had become arithmetic. 14 families relocated, 22 structures damaged beyond repair, and a sound that would follow him for years afterward. Not the sound of violence, but the sound that came after. The sound of a place learning to breathe quietly.
He walked through what remained, boots crunching on glass that caught the light like scattered promises. An old woman sat outside what had been her home, holding a photograph of grandchildren who were now refugees in their own country. She looked up at him, this soldier in uniform who had arrived too late with too little, and asked a question that carried the weight of generations. "Captain, When will they let us defend ourselves?
The question followed him back to headquarters, echoed in briefing rooms where maps were covered in pins marking areas of concern, and lived in the pause that came after every radio call requesting backup that might arrive pending coordination with international partners. It was the same question that rose from the convoy's engines as they rolled through the October night. Not a question of permission, but of patience finally exhausted. The radio crackled once, a brief transmission on an old French military frequency, now abandoned like everything else they had left behind. Static, then silence, then nothing. Traoré's driver, a young man barely 23, whose hands gripped the wheel with the kind of focus that comes only from understanding the stakes, glanced at his commander. "Sir?" "Keep moving," Traoré said quietly. Every kilometer forward was a statement. Every kilometer was a refusal. We defend ourselves not because we were given permission, but because permission itself is the language of the powerless. The convoy had been moving for 3 hours when they passed a checkpoint that had once been manned by international peacekeepers. Empty now. The barriers raised, not in welcome, but in abandonment. Paint fading on signs that still read UN Sector 7 in English and French, languages that had once carried authority, but now felt like echoes from a conversation the world had grown tired of having. As dawn approached, the convoy reached its destination, a fortified hangar on the northern edge of Ouagadougou. The engines shut down one by one, leaving behind a silence so thick you could almost touch it. Soldiers stood beside their vehicles, faces half lit by the first pale thread of light creeping over the horizon, exhausted, uncertain, but standing. One of them, a young lieutenant barely 23, whispered to no one in particular, "We finally own something that can defend us." Traoré turned to him, his voice quiet but unyielding. "No, we finally own the right to defend ourselves." Outside, the desert wind carried the sound toward the horizon, a sound that by morning would echo beyond Burkina Faso's borders, beyond the Sahel, beyond the neat categories that analysts use to explain away the inconvenient. To the west, it would register as a footnote. To Africa, it was the start of a sentence that had waited 60 years to be spoken. But the story of that convoy, the story of engines moving through darkness while the world's eyes were deliberately turned away, that story was only the beginning. Because sovereignty, it turned out, was not a single act of defiance, it was a discipline. And what happened next would prove whether the Sahel could transform that discipline into something the world could no longer afford to ignore. When the West began its great withdrawal from the Sahel, they called it many things: strategic repositioning, resource reallocation, a shift toward multilateral partnerships. They used every euphemism except the one that mattered: abandonment. February 18, 2023. France officially ended Operation Barkhane, pulling 13 years of promises out of Burkina Faso like stitches from a wound that had never properly healed. The ceremony was brief: a flag lowered, speeches about mission accomplished, and assurances that local capacity building would continue through enhanced partnerships. By December, the enhanced partnerships had enhanced themselves into absence. American military advisors withdrew from Niger following the coup that Washington preferred not to understand. European Union training missions suspended operations, citing security concerns that had somehow taken them 13 years to notice. They left behind infrastructure, empty barracks with broken air conditioning, communication systems programmed for frequencies that would no longer answer, an armory stocked with ammunition for weapons they had taken with them when they left. But more than infrastructure, they left behind a question that hung over the Sahel like smoke from a fire no one wanted to extinguish. If we cannot protect ourselves, and you will not stay to protect us, then who decides whether we deserve to survive? The answer came not from diplomats or analysts, but from villages where mothers had grown tired of explaining to their children why safety was always coming next week. From farmers who had learned to plant crops between the schedules of conflicts they had no part in starting. From young soldiers like Traoré, who had spent years arriving too late to places that should never have needed saving. In Cumbri, in Dori, in settlements whose names never appeared in Western newspapers, a consensus emerged that sounded like silence but carried the weight of thunder. If security would not come to them, they would go to security. If sovereignty was not to be granted, it would be purchased. If independence was not to be given, it would be taken. The mathematics were brutal and simple. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, China now accounted for nearly 19% of all major arms imports into sub-Saharan Africa. Once, that statistic had lived only in reports, footnotes buried in documents no one read. Now it moved with the weight of steel and intent through the night. Traoré had seen what followed Western withdrawal in villages across 3 countries. Empty bases where promise had once lived. Broken communication lines that had once connected hope to headquarters in Paris or Brussels or Washington. Schools that had been turned into shelters not by choice, but by the simple arithmetic of abandonment. But he had also seen something else. Communities that had learned to defend themselves, not because they were given weapons, but because they were given no choice. Farmers who had become sentries. Teachers who had become strategists. Children who had learned to read the sky for threats before they learned to read books for knowledge. The convoy that moved through the October darkness carried more than Chinese-made systems and precision-guided hopes. It carried the accumulated weight of every village that had waited for help that never came. Every mother who had whispered promises she could not keep. Every child who had learned that safety was something that happened to other people in other places. Now, let us turn this story into a shared moment. Write in the comments where you are watching from. Your city, your country, your corner of the world. The New Africa Story will read them with gratitude, and we send to each of you a heartfelt wish. May your journey be filled with dignity, hope, and light. This is more than a video. It is a gathering of voices across the globe. The arsenal of independence had a purchase order. 6 VN-22B infantry fighting vehicles at $2.3 million each. 4 SR-5 multiple rocket launchers capable of 70-kilometer precision strikes, priced at $1.8 million per system. 2 WZ-551 command and control vehicles with integrated communication arrays that could coordinate operations across 500 square kilometers without asking permission from anyone. Total cost, $43.7 million. Financed entirely through the National Sovereignty Fund. Built from gold extracted from mines in eastern Burkina Faso, refined in facilities that employed Burkina Bay engineers, and converted into currency that carried no conditions except the obligation to defend the soil from which it came. For comparison, $43.7 million was less than the annual budget for a single Western military base in the region. It was half the cost of the diplomatic conferences that had spent 15 years discussing security without providing it. It was a fraction of the development aid that had developed dependency instead of capacity. But Ibrahim Traoré had learned that sovereignty was not measured by what you could afford to buy. It was measured by what you could afford to build. And what Burkina Faso was building was something the world had not seen in decades. An African nation that purchased its own security with its own resources and answered to its own people. The VN-22B systems were not just armored vehicles. They were mobile statements. Each one carried the capacity to engage threats at ranges that had previously required calling for backup from forces that operated on someone else's timeline. The SR-5 rocket launchers were not just weapons. They were arguments made in steel that some conversations no longer required translation. On November 14, 2024, at the China Air Show in Zhuhai, Burkina Faso's defense minister signed contracts that would have been impossible to imagine just 5 years earlier. Not aid packages, not training programs, not partnerships that came with advisory committees and oversight mechanisms. Purchases, direct, unconditional, paid for with resources pulled from the ground beneath their own feet. The signing ceremony lasted 12 minutes. No speeches about capacity building or regional stability. No conditions about proper use or international coordination. Just signatures on documents that transferred ownership of systems designed to ensure that the word sovereignty meant the same thing in Ouagadougou that it meant everywhere else. Western defense contractors who had spent decades treating African governments as customers for second-hand security watched those signatures with something approaching recognition. This was not aid being distributed. This was commerce being conducted. This was a nation that had learned the difference between being sold protection and buying the means to protect itself. But the convoy that moved through the October darkness carried more than imported systems. It carried the technological DNA of independence, communications equipment that could operate without satellite links to Europe, radar systems that could track threats without asking permission from American databases, and command structures that answered to Ouagadougou before they answered to anyone else. The hangar that housed these systems after their midnight journey was itself a statement. Built with Chinese engineering assistance, but staffed entirely by Burkina Bay technicians. Powered by solar arrays that converted Sahel's sunlight into the electricity needed to maintain systems that would defend Sahel soil. Connected to networks that ran through fiber optic cables laid by African crews who understood that every kilometer of cable was a kilometer of independence. By March 2025, satellite imagery from Planet Labs showed the transformation. What had once been empty ground north of Ouagadougou was now a facility capable of maintaining, repairing, and coordinating the defense systems that had arrived in the darkness of that October night. The Alliance of Sahel States was born not in a conference room, but in the recognition that borders drawn by colonial cartographers meant nothing to threats that moved like smoke across the region. February 16, 2025. In a ceremony broadcast across West Africa, Ibrahim Traoré joined the leaders of Mali and Niger to announce the formal establishment of the AES, an alliance backed by a $3 billion fund drawn from gold mines in Burkina Faso, uranium deposits in Niger, and agricultural exports from Mali's fertile valleys. $3 billion, not borrowed from international markets that came with conditions written in fine print, not granted by development banks that measured success by dependency maintained, earned from resources that had been pulled from African soil by African hands and converted into African security by African decision-makers. The fund represented something unprecedented in the region's post-independence history, the capacity to purchase security without purchasing supervision, to buy defense systems without buying into someone else's definition of what defense should look like, to invest in sovereignty without accepting that sovereignty came with instruction manuals written in foreign languages. But the AES was more than an economic arrangement. It was the institutional recognition of what the October convoy had proven, that security was not something you waited to receive, but something you built, purchased, and maintained through the simple exercise of treating sovereignty like a verb instead of a noun. The alliance's first purchase order included additional VN-22B systems for Mali, upgraded communication equipment for Niger, and shared radar
installations that could track threats across borders without requiring clearance from capitals that had spent decades treating the Sahel like a footnote to more important conversations. By late 2025, the infrastructure of independence stretched across 3 nations. Maintenance facilities in Ouagadougou could service equipment operating in Gao. Communication networks in Niamey could coordinate with command centers in Bamako. Radar installations on the border between Niger and Mali could share information with defense systems in eastern Burkina Faso. For the first time since independence, the Sahel was operating like a region instead of a collection of territories waiting for permission to exist. In his annual address to the Alliance, Traoré framed the transformation with words that carried the weight of decades. We are no longer building walls. We are building capacity. The same discipline that once kept us waiting now teaches us to move. The same patience that once measured itself by others' timelines now measures itself by our own results. The doctrine of deterrence had evolved. It was no longer simply a strategy of protection. It had become a philosophy of progress. The same focus that had been reserved for defense now extended to infrastructure, education, and trade. Roads were being repaired not by foreign contractors who took their expertise with them when the contracts ended, but by regional crews who understood that every kilometer paved was a kilometer owned. Across the Sahel, a feeling was spreading faster than fear ever had: ownership. Not just of weapons or systems or defense capabilities, but of the conversation itself. The conversation about what security meant, what sovereignty required, and what independence looked like when it was built instead of borrowed. Yet every balance carries its burden. The alliance faced rising costs, an estimated $1.1 billion annually just to maintain the systems they had purchased. There was constant scrutiny from abroad. Whispers of sanctions, debates about alignment, warnings about the dangers of independence achieved too quickly. Traoré's response was measured but unyielding. If our progress offends those who preferred our dependence, then let offense be the price of dignity. Before we close, let us pause. What you have just heard is not simply an episode of history. It is a reminder that sovereignty, dignity, and hope are still alive, waiting to be claimed by those brave enough to stop asking for permission. This story does not end. It continues, it grows, it demands to be followed. If this message has moved you, if something in your chest tightened when you heard about Ibrahim Traoré's journey, about Burkina Faso's transformation from dependence to self-reliance, then subscribe to this channel. Not because we ask for numbers, but because we are building a space where voices of independence are honored, where stories of pride are not footnotes but headlines. By subscribing, you are choosing to walk with us into the next chapter of Africa's unfolding story. You are saying, I see this, I hear this, I stand with this. So subscribe now, turn on notifications, and be ready, because what happened in the Sahel is not an ending, but an opening. The sun rose over the Sahel as if it too had been waiting for permission. What began in the silence of that October night had become something larger, not just the movement of systems through darkness, but the movement of an entire region toward a horizon it had chosen for itself. From Ouagadougou to Bamako, from Niamey to villages whose names deserved to be spoken aloud, a truth had taken root that no satellite could track and no analysis could diminish. Sovereignty was not granted by others, but claimed by those who had grown tired of waiting for it to arrive. Ibrahim Traoré once said, "The strength of a people is not in their weapons, but in their will to use them wisely." That wisdom had become the Sahel's legacy, and perhaps its greatest export. The convoy that had moved through 6 minutes and 32 seconds of satellite blindness had delivered more than defense systems. It had delivered proof that dependency was a choice, not a destiny.
That independence was not something you inherited, but something you built with your own hands, financed with your own resources, and defended with your own resolve. And in a world that still spoke of Africa's future in whispers and warnings, the engines that had rumbled through that October darkness had become something else entirely. The sound of a continent that had stopped waiting for permission and started writing its own story instead.